Okay, welcome to the 61st episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Jay Singh. Jay is a men's coach and workshop leader who specializes in helping fathers find a deeper sense of purpose in their lives. He also runs a 10-week program for fathers called The New King. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks so much, Pierce. Great to be here.
Yeah, pleasure. Really, as I was sharing before we press record, for me, this is a subject which is very pertinent. Fathers, as I shared before, I had a terrible relationship with my father, to be
Mm.
honest. Um, and therefore, I think this work is so important. So I'd love you to share a little bit, Jay, about your journey. How did you get into doing this work you now do?
Yeah, great question. I um I first felt really drawn to doing work specifically with fathers. I would say sometime in that first year of becoming a father myself. Um, I I wasn't really prepared, I think, for the level of intensity and shifts that come along with becoming a father. I had one friend in particular that had tried to drill it into me a little bit, or just get me to understand just what a profound change it was. And I think with a lot of aspects of fatherhood, there's no way to really understand it until you live it. And for me, fatherhood has been this, just absolutely beautiful experience, and also one that's been really intense and humbling. And it's brought me to my knees over and over and over again. And in that process of just being pushed to what I perceive to be my limits, whether it's sleep deprivation or it's the emotional triggers of situations, or just feeling the finite nature of my own abilities and energy. It's given me this tremendous opportunity to grow and evolve, and to see places in myself where I still have a lot of work to do, and that I could show up more fully, more courageously, more open-heartedly, more centered, more present. And as I was, kind of in the thick of this, I just realized what a tremendous gift fatherhood is if we approach it as an opportunity for our own inner work and evolution. And I felt such a strong desire to support other men in orienting to fatherhood as a profound opportunity for growing and evolving as a person, and to help give men the tools and resources. I felt so unprepared, frankly, for the level of challenges and also what was actually happening under the surface of fatherhood, and had this deep desire to support other men, and yet I felt terrified to actually do anything with that. So I kind of resisted this calling in my heart for a number of years, until I finally got to places like, like, this just feels like such a primary reason that I'm here on this planet. I want to actually do something with it. And so, kind of pushing past the sense of being an imposter, because I hadn't done anything in the kind of men's workspace around fatherhood. But I participated in the men's circle for a number of years, then started my own circle for fathers after that, and then a few years later, here I am now, kind of running some circles, both in person and online, for men, mostly for fathers, and then also running kind of deeper, more intensive programs than just an ongoing regular circle. So kind of how I got there, in a nutshell. Happy to elaborate more, but yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. What you said there about kind of something along the lines of what was underneath the surface. What was that for you in your fatherhood journey?
Yeah, I feel like there's the challenges that come with fatherhood that are at the surface level. And so for me, there was the intense sleep deprivation that came online, with having a young child. This is with our first. where I just became kind of aware of all these intensities. There is the complete, shift in having a lot of freedom and, to do whatever you want. I mean, in the sense I was married, obviously, before having our daughter, but I, not responsible for keeping someone else alive and for providing for them. And so that change in the level of responsibility, where I can't just, go for a weekend backpacking trip any longer, or, I got you just like all these rhythms that have to change and be built around having a family. So there's a lot of changes to the personal level of freedom that both my wife and I, we weren't able to understand how big of a change that was until we lived it. And then there, is the challenges of, trying to expand our income to provide for having a larger family and then having less bandwidth to do that. So those are kind of some of the surface level pieces of just those intensities. And then I would say kind of more internally, fatherhood, and I think just parenthood in general, it's a pressure cooker in a lot of ways. We turn up the intensity and the heat in our lives. And for me, all these things that I didn't realize were still inside of me, a lot of wounds and triggers. I had told myself, both my wife and I set very high bars for how we wanted to show up as parents. And there were things that I, wanted to kind of emulate that my parents had done, and the things I obviously wanted to do differently. And, thinking that I was going to do them differently versus actually being in the moment and being in these intense situations and being, let's just say really sleep deprived and strung out at some point. Like it was in those moments that, anger would come up that I, had said I would never repeat, that I experienced with my father, or, resentment towards my wife and things like that. And just all these aspects of shadow, essentially, that I had been able to hide from myself, or hadn't had opportunities to even see or experience, were being brought to the surface for me. And I think that's a pretty universal experience for fathers, is that the experience of fatherhood, especially in our culture today, where we don't really have a social framework that's built around supporting families, especially with young kids, that it really drives the level of intensity way up, and it brings to the surface the things that we haven't done work on yet. And I think for me, there's been a reconciliation around, just feeling like I had done a lot of inner work prior to becoming a father, but there are, I think, a lot of things that could only even come to the surface for me really through the fatherhood journey, becoming a dad myself and reliving with my kids some of the moments that I was a child, and some of these kind of deep-seated emotional patterns and ways of being, that, my kids have been the mirror for helping me see. So yeah, there's kind of could go way, I could talk about that the rest of our podcast, but
yeah. Well, thank you. It's interesting. I had never had children myself. I have a stepson, but he was 17 when I came to his life. He was, I think, maybe even 19. I have looked after children as a teacher and also working in childcare. So I have the vague experience. I remember listening to Jordan Peterson say that until you've had children, it's almost like that's the ultimate self-development.
I agree. And I don't say that to diminish the, experiences of someone who doesn't, directly have kids by any means. But in my own personal experience, yeah, just fatherhood took it all to a whole nother level.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I made I think an intention when I was young, in my teens, but also in my 20s, because I was a celibate monk, to not have children. And partly that reason is that I didn't want to turn out like my father and to be like how he was. So I was aware of that. Now it's different. It's like, obviously situations are different, but I remember making that intention that I don't think it's a wise decision, really. So
Yeah, there was a period in my late teens and early 20s where some form of kind of monastic life. I lived at an ashram for a few months. Was very, had an appeal for me, and that wasn't motivated by trying to get away from my own or father or childhood or things like that. But yeah, it didn't end up going that direction long term. But I can resonate with that too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for me, I found the monastic experience, it was like a rite of passage that we don't really have. Obviously, the Mankind Project, others are now, have that. I didn't know about it then, but I saw that it was that transition from boy to man. It's always about me, and then stepping into manhood. How do I serve? So, I'd love for you to share, Jay, a little bit. Some of the challenges. What are some of the challenges that men face as fathers today?
Yeah, so I guess elaborating on some of the examples I had shared, I think there's these internal and external facets of it. I think on the surface of it, fathers generally go through a tremendous kind of change in terms of their level of autonomy and freedom when they become fathers. Depending on how a mother and father might kind of work together in terms of taking care of a child. Generally, dads are also going to be pretty sleep deprived in this day and age, in the early days of fatherhood. Then there is I would just say, all the competing demands. And I think many men in our generation desire to be really present and engaged as dads. And, so being present as a father and, loving and attentive and, having time to engage with and play with our kids is really important as they're young, and, kind of continuing to be present and engaged with them as they get older. And, simultaneously trying to maintain a really healthy marriage, which I think is also, it's a challenge in the face of all these competing priorities. And then there's, doing your own form of work in the world and trying to do something that feels an integrity with yourself and an expression of, some greater purpose for why we're here. And I think, there's a simple financial pressure of providing for a family. And then there's, keeping up the house and, kind of tending to any other number of responsibilities we might have in our community or for extended family. And so there's a great number of, I would say, external pressures and tensions, if you want to call them that. And then on the inside, I think that brings to the surface for many men, myself definitely included here, just a lot of it creates so much intensity that it can essentially just push our buttons, and it'll trigger us. It'll expose whatever unintegrated emotional patterns and wounds we are carrying from our own childhood that we developed in our family of origin as ways to make ourselves feel safe and loved by our parents and our homes. And so for me, I have a tendency to over volunteer in my household. So my wife's having a hard time. Oh, I'll take care of that. I'll do that. And I'll often just kind of reflexively offer to do something along those lines without first checking in with myself and asking, like, A, do I actually want to do this? And B, do I have the bandwidth to do it without having to let go of something else in terms of a responsibility? And if I do take it on, do I need to renegotiate some other commitment? And it's been a big learning edge for me to get out of that. But that was a tendency I've learned, something that I did to try, kind of keeping everyone happy and peaceful in my own childhood home. So I think fatherhood has a tendency to bring up the intensity level such that it forces us to go back to using a lot of these patterns that maybe we've kind of grown past a little bit, but just to bring awareness there. So I think that inner world can become very intense for us. A lot of times men end up feeling like they are alone in their struggles and challenges. And I think that's one of the most universal challenges and lies that men end up believing in, is that they cannot share and express what's actually going on for them inside. And I think a lot of fathers are really struggling on the inside, but feel like it's a sign of weakness to admit that that's going on, or they maybe don't even have anyone that they feel like can actually relate to what their experience is or what their challenges are. It might be that they feel angry and resentful at their wife at times, or they feel frustrated with their kids, or they feel overwhelmed, or they feel, maybe they feel inadequate in some space, or they just feel angry. All these different feelings, a lot of times, are just welling up inside of us. And until I found a father's circle, a lot of these things I didn't have an avenue to share. My wife and I have a pretty open and a communicative relationship, but there's parts of my experience now that were becoming so different from hers, because I was a father and she was a mother, and I couldn't relate to a lot of her pieces of the journey directly myself. And until I found an actual group of other dads and could share and open up about these experiences, I realized that, oh, these are a lot of universal challenges. Other men might have a different set of circumstances, but the intensity that they're experiencing in their life and their challenges are of a similar caliber, or maybe more intense than mine. And just simply getting to experience that was really powerful and deep for me, and it's part of why I wanted to get into the space of working with fathers and supporting them.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, I'm hearing that men, fathers, want to be present, engaged, attentive, and yet, that intensity that comes up. And while I haven't experienced that, I have, as I said, worked with children, and I've noticed that being woken in the middle of the night, and again and again and again, and that intensity there. Yeah, thank you. So I'd love you to segue into now, talking a little bit of marriage and fatherhood as a crucible for personal growth and evolution.
Yeah, it's to me that's been my experience. Fatherhood and marriage they've melted me down. They have humbled me time and time again. And there's been a lot of times it's really uncomfortable. It's not pleasant, right? When I have been brought to my knees in different ways, whether it's having to deal with the fact that I'm so angry that I lose my temper and I, let it out, whether it's with my wife or one of my kids, and then feel remorse for that. And then, just having to realize that that's present inside of me still, this anger that I thought I'd done enough inner work on. It's like, nope, there's still another layer there, or layers. Or some of my own patterns, like I mentioned about, kind of volunteering for things to try keeping others happy and, at peace. And, there's been a lot of times where I've noticed I have a tendency to avoid confrontation. So all of these, these old emotional patterns and wounds and trigger points for me, they've just been brought to the surface time and time again through the inherent challenges in marriage and fatherhood, and showing up deeply and not trying to hide from these things or suppress them or pretend that nothing bad has happened or that I didn't make a mistake or something along those lines. And this journey has just time and time again, it just feels like it is kind of, it's melted me, and then it's forged me into something stronger, something sharper, something, kind of like, melting down and creating an alloyed metal. I feel like there's a lot of pieces of fatherhood where we can willingly go through that alchemy that can happen in fatherhood, of being, humbled and kind of put through this really intense and ongoing rite of passage, or we can resist it and make ourselves and our families miserable in the process. And so I think, to me, that there is this, we don't really talk about, I think, a lot when man is becoming a father, that you're entering this big, kind of unending in many ways rite of passage. And I think part of that is that it's a crucible. It's going to, it has the capacity to really melt us down and forge us into something deeper if we're willing to get really uncomfortable, if we're willing to, to see it in that capacity, or to surrender to that process.
That's a beautiful analogy, the crucible, forging yourself to make yourself stronger. Yeah, that's really beautiful. If someone's listening to this and they've noticed they've been resisting that change and causing pain, a lot of the people who listen to my podcasts are ex-boarders. And for me, I know from my upbringing that I have these unconscious programs. It's like, about anger or other things. If we notice we're resisting, what do you say to fathers?
I think one of the first things is just to be gentle with yourself, right? The reason that we're resisting is probably, again, due to leftover residual programming and this survival behavior that we picked up as kids. For me, another, legacy kind of, childhood challenge that I face is not wanting to be seen as making a mistake. And so, I was really tried to keep my dad happy and tried to impress him, tried to win his love in those areas. And for me, being seen as having messed up or made a mistake, or, whether it's getting a poor grade in school or, making a mistake at home at something, that was kind of terrifying for me. And I was, scared of his judgment or his criticism. And so there have been plenty of times in my own marriage and fatherhood where I resist owning something that I've messed up on or making a mistake. And I kind of dig my heels in at times. And to at the same time, I guess my invitation there would be to have some compassion, for yourself if you're finding that you're resisting some of these things, some of these kind of processes or the alchemy that's available to us as fathers. There's a reason behind that. And then to also just, allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling in the given moment. And to actually ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? And then to literally tell ourselves, like, that's a right way to feel. Like, even if it's I am angry at my kid right now, and that's a right way to feel. It's not that, acting on the anger is the right thing to do, but having that feeling inside of our body, we can't like stop that from having happened. And if we resist it, or we label it, or we try to push it away, we push it into shadow, that's not going to serve. So I think a huge part, in the work that I do in with men, a big piece of that is just tuning into, like, what are we actually feeling right now? And then saying that's a right way to feel. Like, there's no judgment around that. And then asking ourselves, what do we need? Because usually behind those feelings is an underlying need that isn't getting met, whether it's something that we even can meet in that moment, maybe not, but at least even acknowledging that need starts to help us to re-relate to these feelings that we have a programmed response in ourselves to, like, push our anger away, or if we have sadness to push that under and keep that covered up. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm hearing, if we feel that resistance, to bring awareness. And I love what you say, that's the right way to feel. Yeah. I think I remember the abbot saying to me once, there's nothing wrong with anger. I'm like, yes, there is. And he's like, no, it just is. It's what you do with the anger. And, I used to do some quite unpleasant things with my anger, more to myself. So I really love that's the right way to feel. So yeah, that definitely makes sense. Thank you, Jay. So yeah, the next question I have is about conscious masculinity, and especially in the context of fatherhood. Could you talk to that a little bit, please?
Sure. Now, I think with this whole theme of seeing fatherhood and marriage as this opportunity for growth, it's this invitation to continue evolving as men and to try and show up in a more conscious way. And I think it's a process. It's not that there is here's conscious masculinity and here's unconscious masculinity. It's all this, this kind of spectrum, and we're growing in our own ways. I mean, individually and collectively, across humanity right now on our planet. And I think within the context of fatherhood, showing up consciously, I think to me, it means showing up with a lot of presence for ourselves and also with our family members, with our partner and with our children, showing up open-heartedly, being willing to love fully, love freely. I think within those containers, it's taking responsibility for how we're showing up, whether it's our emotional state or how we're communicating, how we're interacting, and really owning how we show up, and then owning our mistakes. I think this is a big edge that my wife and I are both working on right now as parents, is just embracing the messiness of parenthood, that we are inherently going to keep making mistakes, and then to be honest with our children about all of that. And I think in the earlier years, it was easier for me in some ways to admit a mistake to my daughter and apologize to her. And as she's gotten older and more emotionally complex, and my feelings around her upsets have gotten more complex myself, there's been times that I don't want to own, my responsibility in those situations. And so it's, bringing that willingness to own how we're showing up. I think another aspect of it is standing, anchored in our own power as men, and a good and healthy form of that power. So not the toxic forms of masculinity where, we see kind of dictatorship energy or oppressive forms of masculine energy, or, conversely, we see kind of the abdicating king, archetype, the unwillingness to kind of shoulder responsibility or avoid necessary confrontation and conflict. And so I think another piece of kind of conscious masculinity is embracing that need for healthy boundary setting, healthy conflict, and not shying away from it, and approaching it though from a place of openness and presence rather than reactivity or anger, or desire to get into a fight. I think another aspect of it is being willing to be deeply self-reflective and look at how we're showing up, and commit ourselves to doing that over and over again in a better way, each time continuing to learn and grow. And I think there's this in addition to showing up with presence, there's also just showing up with a sense of spaciousness, that we do enough of our own kind of inner work, or we resource ourselves such that we have the bandwidth to hold the storms, in our lives, or the storms in our partner's life or our kids' lives, or their big feelings, and to be able to actually anchor and hold space for them to feel the fullness of those feelings without getting totally swept up in our own feelings and reactions. And we can only really do that when we've done something to nourish ourselves, that we've made time, whether it's for me it's spending time in nature is a big piece of that. It's going for a walk by the river, or sitting in the woods, or literally just sitting on the ground and soaking in some sunshine. It's it's that continual process of filling my own bucket such that I actually have the capacity to show up as my better self. So those are, I think some of the qualities I would say that, kind of how you can bring a kind of conscious form of masculinity into fatherhood.
It's interesting because I had another podcast this morning with a psychiatrist talking about trauma. It's interesting how they overlap. One of the things about mistakes you mentioned before, it's one of the things that this psychiatrist was talking about, the importance of purposefully making mistakes in order to heal trauma. So I love that opening up that willingness to make mistakes, and self-reflecting as well was another thing she said about, that we need to self-reflect, and then filling up our own bucket, as you mentioned, going out into nature, doing those things. So yeah, really see these conversations kind of flowing into each other, which is beautiful. How for you can we cultivate more self-reflection, Jay?
Sorry, ask your question. How can I cultivate more self-reflection?
Yeah, well, how do you suggest for people, this self-reflecting? What do you do? Is it a specific time you journal, or you sit in nature and you just give yourself time to do? What do you do?
I guess I don't have a set specific process or practice that I use around it. A lot of it is just, it's on the fly, I'll say, because, the most common time is I get triggered and I have a reaction to my kid's behavior. So let's say my daughter gets really upset or my son gets, really worked up. For me, my daughter, being older, she's right now she pushes my buttons more than my son does. My son's still 2, my daughter's about to turn 7. So, let's say my daughter's had some really big feelings, and then in the process, I end up starting to feel some big feelings. I start to feel angry or frustrated, or, and whether or not I act on it out loud, there might be times where after the moment, I'll sit and I'll take some space. I'll ask my wife, hey, I need to go calm down. Or, we've also had a practice where like, hey, you know what, I need to go get my feelings out in the garage. And so I'll go down there and we have a punching bag where like either we put on punching gloves or we have a, plastic bat, and we beat on that bag just to get some of that energy out. And then after that, just being able to clear-headed look and say like, whoa, like what came up for me there? Or was I actually, like, even though I thought I was handling it with, kind of a sense of neutrality, I wasn't. My buttons were totally pressed, and I was shaming my daughter with some of my language, even though I don't want to be doing that. So a lot of times with the day-to-day situations, and pretty much every day brings up something, at least one situation will unfold, in our home where I've made a mistake, or my buttons have gotten pressed, or I've got pushed to an edge, and it's reflecting on what's happened for me, or how am I feeling? So again, it's ask myself, like, how am I feeling right now? And if I can remember, like, to tell myself that's a right way to feel. That's a practice that my wife shared from a program that she was doing, and it's been just like a huge anchor for both of us, for a while. And so with a lot of those, I guess, kind of smaller but yet important kind of day-to-day, moment by moment pieces, I think reflecting in real time is important. Because if I have, let's say some big, dramatic experience with my daughter, where let's say she gets really upset about going to school in the morning, doesn't want to go to school, and then I'm getting frustrated, but we got to get out the door because I got an appointment after dropping you off and can't be late, and so, if I can give myself the space to actually, pause and ask myself, how was I feeling in this moment? Or, what am I actually upset about? Because I think a lot of the times I notice for myself and for many men, they'll see this as we dig into this, that the emotions that we'll end up feeling in the moment are so much bigger than what the actual triggering situation justifies, right? It's not just that my daughter's, having her human 6-year-old emotions about not wanting to go to school this morning. It's like, well, what am I actually frustrated about? And if I peel back, a few layers, like, oh, it's because I'm upset that she's feeling feelings that maybe I didn't feel like I was allowed to feel as a kid right now about this. And so for me, a lot of that kind of reflection, I'm trying to just create little pockets. It might be that it's just in the quiet in the car, then on the way to school, that I, I'm able to kind of sit with that. Or maybe it's, out going for walk by the river later that day or something like that. A lot of times I'm reflecting on what's going on through conversation with my wife or through conversation with other men in a men's circle. And then there's times too that, it is, it's through journaling or some more intentional practice that might be more removed, or it's reflection that maybe I'm doing as I'm taking kind of a more considerable chunk of time for myself. But for me, I've just come to a place where I feel like I have to often kind of reflect on the fly, many times a day on where I'm at. And if I don't do that, then my feelings are they're just sitting in there kind of simmering. And I might be able to push them out for a while, but then the next time something comes up, it's right there waiting for me. So
thank you, Jay. That's self-reflecting. Yeah, some great ideas. Yeah, and I guess as being a busy father, it has to be on the fly, because that's the only space or time we really have.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something to be said about having, let's say, a morning practice or some type of evening practice. A lot of evenings after we get the kid done, I'll take some time to intentionally do a really short kind of relaxation practice and just allow myself to just really drop into my body. But there's a lot of times I'm just really tired at that point in time. I'm not necessarily like actively mentally reflecting. I'm just taking an exhale, from the day. So yeah, I think, but some men that I'll sit in circle with, like they have a really dedicated, larger container of time in the morning, and they wake up really early and they do that work. I think that becomes easier as your kids get older and their sleep habits become more predictable and consistent. For a lot of my kids' early years, and this is just finally changing, sometimes their kid would wake up at 4:30 and they're up for the morning. And so if I wanted to definitely do a morning practice before my kids woke up, I'd have to wake up at 4, or my wife would need to be watching the kids before that. And then once the kids are up in the house, it just kind of it's hard to to get to a really peaceful place in a small home.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question I have is, you mentioned this idea of purpose. How do we start to create a life of purpose? And I just want to check as well, time-wise, do you need to head off after a certain time?
Don't have a hard stop.
You don't have a hard stop. Great. So I've got a few more questions. I think, I haven't asked you that many, so.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm happy to talk as long as you want.
Okay, great. So I guess it's, how do we start to create a life of purpose, and passion as a father? How do we do that?
I think it just depends on every individual father. For me, I entered fatherhood doing work, and continue to do work in the environmental restoration space. That early on in my professional career, like that was all I wanted to do, was focus on environmental restoration work. And after having kids and just kind of feeling this growing calling to support fathers, there was this desire to do work in the men's workspace and specifically supporting fathers, and just not feeling like and having all these excuses why I didn't have time for it, or I wasn't ready to do it, or maybe I needed to have lived more years as a father, gotten more experience as a dad. Maybe my kids need to be grown up and out of the house before I feel like I have something to teach here. So I had all these reasons why I wasn't ready. And I think a lot of men, it's really individual. Some men are doing their life's work as they become fathers, and that continues to be what is called them, in terms of that. David Data has, I think, a description of it, calling it layers of the onion, where we have, kind of a layer of purpose. And sometimes we reach a point of completion, and that layer of purpose kind of gives way to another layer of purpose that's there. And there's a time in between those layers of purpose where there's this kind of searching process where we don't know, and we have to be open and receptive to that. And so with a lot of fathers that I work with, some of them know what they want to be doing, and sometimes aren't actually taking those big, bold, and courageous actions to advance it. And others are kind of in between layers of purpose. They were doing something maybe that was really meaningful to them, or maybe they took a job because they needed to find whatever way they could to provide as much income as they could for their families, or maybe they changed careers to provide more lucrative means for their family, and they haven't gotten back to something that really fills them. Mm-hmm. And over time, I think that can often, I think for men or for individuals that really have a masculine essence, if you're not kind of living your purpose, it can end up taking a lot of that sense of aliveness out of our lives, that sense of fulfillment, that sense of real deep meaning. It's not that fatherhood isn't meaningful, but it's just that I think for many men, they need some sense of contribution of their highest and greatest purpose to really feel deeply fulfilled. And so, I think for some men, it's just clarifying their purpose, or it's actually just starting to take those bold, courageous actions that feel uncomfortable, and they always do. I feel like when it's with our purpose, at least initially, it takes a lot of courage to take those initial actions. It's definitely the case for me with kind of my journey into doing men's work and then offering, running men's groups and containers, and then, kind of deeper programming. And for men who don't have actual clarity in the moment, I think one of the best things is to create space to feel into that. I offer some guided processes in one of my programs for men to help them actually kind of get clarity about what they feel called to do. And sometimes men are that immediate sense of feeling of knowing comes up, and for other men, it's this ongoing search process that they have to kind of keep sifting through. But the biggest piece of that is just creating space for there to be a discovery of purpose, or a connection to a sense of purpose. And a lot of times it means putting away distractions. So it's like, don't have your phone out, just go sit, don't read a book in that moment, literally do nothing. Maybe it's pray for guidance about what it is that I'm here to do. Or maybe it's just, ask the universe, if it's not necessarily a prayer, or it's just ask yourself, like, what do I deeply feel like doing? Or another useful tool is connecting with our own mortality, our own, finite amount of time on this planet. We get used to thinking that we've got this like unending amount of time, on our planet. And as the days can be, pretty long at times as a dad, in terms of just the intensity of it. And it can be easy at times to be looking forward to this time when my kids are sleeping through the night, or my kids aren't having tantrums, or my kids are old enough to, hang out independently, or go to another kid's house and play, or just like, as our kids grow up and to get into this place of kind of not really being present with our time. And so I often invite men to connect with the inevitability of death as a means for summoning that sense of purpose. Like, if I know I'm going to die, what would I regret not having done? And looking kind of squarely in the eye at our mortality can often be a powerful way to connect with that sense of like, what is it that I'm here to do that I would feel incomplete about if I were to die tomorrow? So I think those are all things that I do to help men kind of connect with that sense of purpose. And then a big piece of it after that is then start taking actions to do something about it. And to not just, kind of dance around the edges of it, but to really kind of lean in and do something to advance it. And men, I think, know in their hearts when they are avoiding moving something forward versus they're actually leaning in and they're taking those big and bold and, scary feeling actions. And so once we start doing that, though, the sense of, purpose and fulfillment and aliveness really come with that, and the sense of progress and momentum. And I think that's one of the things that like deeply feeds men, is a sense of mission and actually bringing that mission to life.
Yeah. The sense of knowing my purpose, but then making those steps towards it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's how I think we help men build lives of purpose and passion, is knowing the mission, knowing the purpose, and then actually moving things forward along that journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Well, very wise.
And I think I'll just add it, like, it in the context of fatherhood, it gets really easy to make excuses about why we can't do that, why we've got to just focus on paying the bills, being present with our kids, being present with our partner, taking care of our physical bodies and, emotional well-being, spiritual well-being. And at times it can be easy to have, I've had it myself, for many years, I told myself why I couldn't do something in the men's work space. I couldn't support other men. I couldn't run, men's group. I couldn't create a program. And I had a long list of excuses that, seemed easier to justify being a dad with all these other responsibilities. And I think looking at that squarely in the eye, and for me, it was recognizing that I was actually just afraid under the surface. I was afraid to have uncomfortable conversations with my wife about what I needed to do to be, deeply fulfilled as a man. I feel like I was living my purpose here on this planet. And I needed to be able to say, like, I need to make time for this, even if we feel like we don't have the time and space in our kind of busy lives right now. It's, taking those uncomfortable actions. For me, I was afraid of being seen in this space or feeling like someone would see me as an imposter. So I think those are some of the pieces that, in the context of fatherhood, a lot of us, there's the initial intensity of kind of starting a family, and then we can get into patterns and we don't revisit them, and we have all these assumptions about what we can and cannot do. And I think there's a lot of power in revisiting all of that in a container with other men, and realizing that I could actually do something different here if I exercise more courage, or I built my muscle of courage up.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Yeah, I can resonate with that. I think I felt a lot of fear myself, and I would move forward a little bit, I'd get a rejection, and then I'd try something else. Move forward a little bit, get a reject, and I was just spiraling around. And it was my wife, who kept saying, just focus on one thing. And when I did that, and underneath was the belief within myself that I was a failure, that I'm a failure. And once I helped release that, then it's like, oh, it doesn't matter if I mess up. Coming back to that thing you were saying about mistakes, it's like, yeah, there we go. I made a mistake again. It's all right. So I certainly got stuck in that loop with my purpose. I didn't want to make a mistake, so therefore I didn't do anything.
I relate. I relate to that.
Yeah. I think with my podcast, the first person I reached out to was Rod. And I think it was that Rod Boothroyd, this idea of, I've been wanting to have conversations with people for years, but it was really around the pandemic, COVID, that thought, right, people are struggling. This is the time. And that was the impetus for me. Right, I'll put my book out there. I'll do this. So, yeah, thank you. So, another question I have, again, share as much as you would like to or not, is because I think it is an important question, really, is this idea of what it was like growing up for you with a father who went to boarding school. And the reason I feel it's an important question is that so many of us have leaders who have been to boarding school, and therefore indirectly they're kind of fathering us, telling us what to do. So I'd love for you to share a little bit of your experience, what it was like, and now you're doing this work, what insights?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we initially had spoken a month ago, I hadn't thought a whole lot about, back. So my dad, he went to boarding school, and my dad is Indian, so I'm half Indian. That's why my name is Jay Singh and spelled the way it is. And the boarding school that he was set up, I think, was modeled on the British, forms of boarding schools. And his father was in the Indian military, and you know, I don't know. My dad was pretty young when he was sent to boarding school, maybe 8 or 9, something like that, maybe even younger. I'm not actually quite sure, and I haven't really spoken to him a whole lot about his experience of being in boarding school. But I know that the process of leaving at an early age and living away from his parents was pretty traumatic for him. And I know that the boarding school environment, had it was a challenging space for him growing up. I think my dad was a really sensitive person, and from what I gathered, the kids in boarding school can be pretty uh merciless in terms of any of your weaknesses or perceived flaws or just things that they can find to make fun of you about. They go for it. And so my dad, I think that was a pretty challenging environment in a lot of ways for him to grow up. I mean, I think it gave him a lot of kind of great educational opportunities and things along those lines. And a lot of the people that went to his boarding school have, pretty accomplished and have done well for themselves. But I can only imagine that a lot of them have a lot of traumas, whether it's with a kind of capital T or a lowercase t, operating under the surface from that experience. And in terms of my dad and how what my experience was growing up with him, my dad did a lot of pieces of his experience that I think he very consciously and actively chose to not repeat in how he parented me. And one of the things was that he was extremely dedicated to being physically present as my father. And my dad was a consultant for his career, and often was had the invitation to take on travel consulting assignments. And I think that would have helped him kind of grow his career faster if he'd wanted to, or maybe make more money. But he always chose to be local. And so my dad was always home at night. He was always around on the weekends. And so, I mean, that physical presence was a big piece. I was never, I think my dad would never have considered sending my daughter or my sister and I to a boarding school. So, I was always around my father growing up. And my father was, as I got out of the kind of very early years of life, he was my, I would say, primary source of affection and kind of outward love. My mother is pretty, I would say, just kind of emotionally reserved, and my dad is the one that was always playing with me or roughhousing or cuddling with me on the couch. A lot of my physical contact with a parent was actually with my father, in terms of kind of filling that need for affection as a kid. And so I think my dad, I don't think those are things that he probably had as a child. Definitely not during his boarding school time at school. And so my dad, he did a lot to completely, I think, 180 in terms of what his experience was as a father. And those are all huge gifts and things that were modeled that I wanted. Like, I'm very, warm and affectionate and playful father. I'm very present in my kids' lives. I've had the ability to work from home ever since my daughter was born. And so I've been able to be very physically present in her life. And then I think there's, pieces of my dad's journey through boarding school that, he wasn't able to necessarily, he hasn't resolved per se, or hadn't resolved by the time, I was born. And as a young child, where, some of the deeper emotional wounds and traumas, whether it was the simple act of being sent away, I think it's kind of a really big form of abandonment, to be pushed away from your mother at such a young age for such sustained and long periods of time. I think that's a challenge. And then just some of the kind of, bullying and things like that happen in the boarding school environment. And so I think my dad, he'd actually done a lot of kind of therapy, from what I understood, from by the time I was born. It's what he had told me till later on. But he, I think there was a lot of, like kind of deeper emotional wounds and things like that. I'm not sure really if he'd done much somatic work, so there's a lot of things that hadn't been processed. And so my dad had a healthy amount of anger and rage that he wasn't necessarily wearing on the surface, but he'd bottle up his emotions and feelings, bottle them up, and then all of a sudden he'd blow up. And so as a child, I remember just feeling very afraid of my dad's emotional volatility. And there were, so how much of that is boarding school versus just kind of early childhood, parenting environment, hard to untangle. The difference is there, but I think there were things that my dad did that were very different, from his own experience, that were a huge blessing. And I think there's kind of leftover pieces of his own trauma that he wasn't necessarily able to, heal, integrate, or bring to the surface. And so that we're driving some of his behaviors and patterns as a father, and what my experience was as a kid. So I don't know if that answers your question there, at least partly.
Does. That's really useful. And I was listening to a podcast with Jordan Peterson, talking to a man who was kind of doing parkour with kids. And he said the importance of roughhousing for children to learn boundaries. And it's like, oh, yeah. So as you spoke, it's like, yeah, see that, the importance of touch. And interesting, I heard an example in one of the Mankind projects in the UK, branches, which is about not a Band of Brothers, Journeyman, which is more working with 14 to 18-year-old boys who are in trouble, basically, or struggling. And one of the guys was sharing a story of, there was one boy, 14, 15-year-old, who was quite angry. And this man just said, would you like to do some wrestling? And this guy had been quite angry for a few days. And he just wrestled with him for half an hour, 30 seconds or a minute. And afterwards, the guy totally changed, dropped in and totally engaged with the process. And it just took that roughhousing, connecting. Yeah, I think, it's lovely to hear that you can change. So thank you for sharing. So I realize we've been talking about an hour now, so I'm aware I've still got a few questions left. And I guess, is there anything that you really feel is important to share about your message, about fatherhood, which we've not spoken about yet, Jay?
It's a great question. I think this kind of building on some of the themes here, but I would just encourage any fathers listening to this podcast to really just embrace fatherhood as this unending and beautiful, powerful, humbling journey of inner growth and inner work, and to not necessarily use it just as a means for kind of our own evolution, obviously, as men, but to really embrace everything that fatherhood brings up, and all of the ways that it pushes our buttons, all of the ways that it stretches us to our limits, or what maybe is beyond what we thought our limits were, all of the ways it asks us to show up in ways that maybe feel uncomfortable for us, we don't feel prepared to do, is to just, I think, really orient to fatherhood as much as we can remember. And there's going to be times where, there's plenty of times where I just like oh my gosh, like I'd rather not be a dad today. It's like, if I could just take a break, for a week, I'd like that. Or, I mean, there's just times where I feel just totally exasperated and I just want to get away from it all. But as much as we can to see fatherhood as this enormous gift to continue doing work on ourselves, and as an invitation to really create a powerful aspect of our legacy on this planet, is how like what we're kind of, what we're creating through our kids. And, obviously our kids come into the world with their own, nature, kind of the nature versus nurture, but, a lot of how I think our kids turn out has a lot to do with like how we're parenting them, and to just really dedicate ourselves to that continual process of making mistakes and then reflecting on them, forgiving ourselves or accepting ourselves as human and ultimately kind of flawed beings, and within that humanness, like find the capacity to love ourselves, find the capacity to love our children, find the capacity to love our partners, and to embrace that deep humanness, and to see fatherhood as this great opportunity to continue kind of growing and sharpening. I think fatherhood has done wonders for me in terms of helping me access my own inner king in a lot of ways, that kind of king archetype. And a piece of it is that my little kingdom, if you will, in terms of my family specifically, needs me to show up as a courageous leader that's going to do whatever is necessary to advocate or kind of protect their interests or do what is necessary. And I remember an early time in my journey as a father, it was shortly after my daughter was born, and my wife was having a pretty protracted kind of recovery from the birth, and she's really, really emotionally, energetically sensitive person, and the idea of having both my parents staying in our house, this is when we were living in California in a pretty small home, and just being around them all the time when she had been so opened up by the birth journey and was so opened up physically, she didn't want to have them in our house in terms of staying at the house with us. And for me, and kind of like especially in Indian culture, the idea of not welcoming your family, just kind of letting them kind of barge in, do whatever, just felt like this really it felt like this like really alienating boundary to have to put up with my parents. And I was terrified of the idea of telling my family, like, no, I can't have you guys staying with us physically. When you come stay, you can come visit us. Obviously, we'd love to have you. We'd like love and need to have your help right now, but it's really important to also for us to have some space. And I'll never forget how agonizing it was to get to a place where I finally decided to actually have that conversation, set that boundary with my parents. And the reason I guess I'm bringing that all up is that to me is one of these pivotal moments in my own kind of journey into becoming a father, and ultimately kind of embracing that responsibility of being the king for my family, and to essentially have this really uncomfortable conversation, setting a boundary that ended up like, my dad in particular was upset about it for like at least a year and a half after, and it really like put our relationship on the rocks. But it was necessary for me to kind of, in some ways, like formally kind of break the allegiance I had to my parents and my old nuclear family and establish my new kingdom. And I hadn't done that earlier on in my own kind of journey in such a profound way. And in doing that, though, it was kind of, I learned that I had to do whatever was necessary to essentially, serve my little kingdom, in this case, my family. And seeing these opportunities through fatherhood as this invitation to step into our king energy and that kingship, and a willingness to shoulder responsibility that is unrelenting, and to kind of selflessly serve the kingdom. And it's not to do it from a place of martyrdom where we are sacrificing ourselves, because the king, if we look at it, I think the king archetype really served in terms of how we show up as fathers. If we I've struggled with, like I mentioned earlier in the call, this kind of over volunteering. I keep saying yes to things to the point that I don't have time left to, let's say, exercise or have downtime for myself, or have just time to go let's say hang out with a friend, or go to a men's circle, or go to a retreat of some form. And at the same time, like a king can't serve his kingdom if he himself is also not resourced, if he's kind of fried and at his edge. And so that's actually a reason why I call that the 10-week program that I run the new king, where it's kind of embracing, stepping into that king energy and connecting with the kind of aspects of the king archetype and continuing to kind of cultivate those in our own relationship with fatherhood. A willingness to be selfless in service to our kingdom, also taking care of ourselves, a willingness to act with a lot of courage, even when something looks or feels absolutely terrifying. Living just deeply anchored in our hearts and opening our hearts over and over and over again, even if we feel hurt by, our partner or even by one of our kids in the moment, and just being willing to just kind of sit with that and then open up again, to take off our armor and be willing to receive the feedback from our partner and to treat it as a gift rather than like, oh, this is my wife nagging me about this or criticizing how I'm not showing up well. Doesn't she see all the other things I'm doing? But instead to saying like, well, my wife is a great mirror for helping me, like, especially see where I'm out of integrity, where I'm not doing the things that I said I would do, or I'm not living in alignment with the vision that I've told her that I want to live out in terms of how I show up as a father. So those are just, I guess, a few things that come to mind, Piers, in terms of that I hadn't shared, I guess, is really just kind of, connecting with our own inner king as fathers and using that to help us, mold our own journey in terms of how we show up as fathers, and to also summon that inner king, because that king archetype, I didn't appreciate really until I was a dad, just how deeply alive it is in all of us. That like we can, and each father that I've had go through a process of kind of like describing their own king, they have their own take on it, but it has these kind of universal truths, but it also has their beautiful and individual spin on it. But I think, living from that place of king as we can remember it, I think is just such a powerful practice in fatherhood, and drawing that king energy into fatherhood is a really powerful tool. So
thank you, Jay. Yeah, I do love that, bringing the king online and seeing that linking in with fatherhood. So yeah, beautiful. So how do people learn more about your work or reach out to you if they're interested?
Thanks. Yeah. I have a website, so they could check out if they're interested. This 10-week program, it's called The New King, as I mentioned. It's specifically tailored for fathers, and helps us clarify and advance our sense of purpose or mission in the world. It really has a piece focused on improving our relationship with ourselves and tending to that, and then from there also showing up more powerfully, more open-heartedly, more lovingly in our relationship with our partners and our children. So if men are interested in that, I would encourage them to take a look at my website. And
that's awakenedmasculine.com.
Yeah, awakened-masculine.com.
Brilliant.
And I also, I guess if any man is listening to this podcast and the things that I'm saying really resonate with him, I'm happy to give you a link, Piers, that you could post to just book a call with me, and I can open up a little space in my calendar for any men that are really, I think, resonating with both the challenges they face in fatherhood and then that desire to really take their game to the next level in some form, as a man, as a husband, as a father. So I could send a link for that, and then I've got a YouTube channel and an Instagram account that I've got a few things on there, but it's not terribly fleshed out at this point. But those are different ways that folks, and I'm based in the United States in a city called Richmond in state of Virginia. It's a little bit south of Washington, D.C., and I run a local fathers group here as well. And that's something, if someone happens to be based in Richmond, Virginia, and they're interested, I would encourage them to contact me too about participating in that group. But otherwise my offerings are online. So
Great. Well, you're doing amazing work. It's really inspiring to know there are people out there teaching fathers how to father, how to develop their inner kingdom. So really thank you for doing this work, Jay.
Thanks, Piers. And I mean, I don't pretend to know that I know a bunch of things about fatherhood. I'm in the thick of it myself right now, learning as I go and learning with the men. But yeah, father has been such a beautiful blessing for me, and such an intense journey. So yeah, a lot of beauty there, and a lot of growth.
Well, thank you. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Piers.